No, it's perfect. We're actually just on time. So welcome everyone. Glad to see so many of you joining us in week 2. So the idea of this is based on the Flash Talk series that was organized in the past 2 terms, which we thought was great, really concise way of getting information across, and also not an overload of information in 2 hours. And so we wanted to bring this in a way, try to bring this here, and specifically also in relation to Professor Biao, who's facilitating the Campus Coronavirus Mobility Forum. And so in the next few weeks, a lot of the authors that have published on there are going to come on here to present their work and discuss their work also together. And we're specifically trying to do that in partnership with a more senior and a more junior figure. In this case, Biao, you have the seniority. To bring this dialogue forward. But we're trying to do it also quite fast. So we're committed to ending this call around 2:55 UK time. We'll try to keep to about Biao talking for maximum of 20 minutes, which doesn't mean you have to do 20 minutes, and John for a maximum of 10, at which point we'll switch to a Q&A, which would also last about 20-25 minutes, at which point any other questions, you can find them online, and we'll just end the call there and all go back to our lives. And for questions, when you message everyone can see the questions. So if you have any questions even during the talk, don't wait for us to switch to Q&A to ask the questions. But Tamoy and myself have prepared also some questions just to get us started, because I'm always stressed when a talk ends and there's like any questions, and then there's a silence because everyone's thinking of a question. So we thought of some questions already in that sense. Yeah. Tamoy, do you have anything that I was missed? No? Okay. So perfect. So just as a way of a quick introduction, Professor Biao is a professor of social anthropology here in Oxford. And he works beyond facilitating this mobility forum, works a lot on issues relating to internal and international migrants. And interestingly, he's posted 4 articles so far on the forum, and on topic ranging from chain reaction, grid reaction, to the epidemic, and relating it also to the 2003 SARS outbreak in China, but more related to today's topic on mobilities in livelihood, and on recently, the most recent article was on point-to-point labor transport. And John is a journalist and a researcher on urban issues. He was also one of the first to post or to be featured in the forum. He's currently undertaken an MSc in Transport, City and Planning at the University College of London, now remotely. And he's also working with the Oxford Urbanist, and also posting some of his reflections and writing on there. So I'd recommend you also to check that out. And on a more lighter note, Biao is also a jogger. You can see him in the meadow sometimes running very early in the morning. And John is an avid gardener that you can find behind St. Anthony's gardening plot. So if that's all right with you, Biao, we'd love to start with you then.
Great, thank you so much, Maurice, and thank you so much, Tamoy, for organizing this. Of course, I'm as a facilitator of the forum, I feel very honored and pleased that you decided to have a serious discussion about some of the posts there. First of all, may I just to talk a bit about the purpose of this forum. The format of this forum is a kind of blog series, but actually is much more than a blog. And most posts there actually are mini research questions, mini research papers. We don't have a review committee, but I actually read all the drafts, and almost without exception, I sent back the first drafts and asked the author to revise and very often rewrite. because we have too many opinions in this world, especially in relation to coronavirus. So we don't need any more mantras that saying the poor are vulnerable and then the precarious almost always suffer the most in crisis. I mean, that is just true, but there's no point to repeat the truth many times. And we actually would rather be more interested in hearing some incorrect, politically incorrect, but empirically interesting and puzzling observations. So most papers try to identify some empirical puzzles that we cannot explain straight away, and therefore point to some concrete research questions. So therefore, in this sense, there are many research papers, they have data, they have empirical description, and they have certain analysis to say why that is interesting, and then pointed to some bigger questions. I will be very pleased if some of you are interested in contributing something like that. Actually, we don't need any grand statement, just a very specific, a worm-eyed view of the world from a particular corner. That is the most beautiful, most interesting, rather than making general statements. Then talking about the mobile livelihood, may I start with one qualification of a point that I made in my original essay, which I assume some of you have read, so I don't repeat. In that essay, of course, I make a distinction between mobile lively people with mobile livelihoods on one hand and migrants on the other. I mean, the main point is that we should not focus on migrants as a population, as a demographic group only, because now so many people, regardless of your official status, are mobile. And many people rely on mobility for their livelihood, you're migrants or not. And of course, there is certain connections between being migrants and then you have to be mobile in order to survive. I mean, especially in global north, many Uber drivers and many delivery workers, they are migrants. And also in global south, many beggars are migrants from the countryside, etc. But that needed to be theoretically analyzed, should not be taken for granted. I mean, the connection between migration and mobility, it is not a given. I mean, then I said the people with a mobile livelihood are the people who rely on mobility as a means of work of themselves, as well as rely on other people's mobility in order to have the demand for their service. That is not very accurate. Actually, what we have witnessed over the last 1 month or two is actually many people with mobile livelihoods rely on other people's immobility in order to have demand for their service. Many people with a mobile livelihood are actually moving on behalf of other people who choose not to move, right? Just considering the huge increase of this delivery workers' size, in the light of many people, particularly middle-class urban families, they decide not to go out at all. So there is a process of outsourcing of mobility from one group to another. So that's one qualification. And the third point I want to make is actually mainly I want to hear from you. What do you think next step will be? I have been thinking of mobile livelihoods, the old and the new. On one hand, mobile livelihood is one of the most traditional lifestyle. I mean, before the agricultural society, we know we're all nomads. We rely on mobility in order to find fresh food and in order to find the grasslands for our cattle. We have to move in chasing resources in order to survive. And the birds, of course, have to move back and forth between winter and summer. And then you have, particularly in India, I worked on India, so India is always a reference point for me. And a large number of people actually rely on mobility for livelihood in cities. They deliver milk, they deliver newspapers, and actually banks and also lots of clerks in this financial sectors actually are mobile, going from household to household to collect the debt or sign documents. And in both in China and India, there's a group of people, probably you guys don't know, is called represents or agents of pharmaceutical companies. They travel from hospital to hospital to persuade the doctors to prescribe certain medicine produced by the pharmaceutical companies that they represent, and then will give kickback to the doctors. So there's a lot of this mobility. I mean, there's a notion called the people as infrastructure. When the physical infrastructure is relatively weak, you need lots of people like rickshaw pullers and the coolies who carry heavy stuff for you as a fabric of social life. I mean, that is old mobile livelihood. But what we're really looking at now, I think, is a new style of mobile livelihood, especially during the pandemic and afterwards. That is a type of mobile livelihood is increasingly mediated or controlled by platform companies. So they are highly mobile, but the mobile not in a fleeing way, and but it's tightly organized and extremely accurately regulated. You know, the drivers or the delivery workers have to follow certain route in order to maximize the efficiency of their mobility, which has lots of consequences, for example, to their health and to their safety. They have to often ride bicycles, and more often is motorcycle in a quite dangerous way in order to beat the time to get more orders, etc. So I mean, there's many implications as a result of this platformatization of mobility. So therefore, this is what will be next step? So that one is platform become more important. Number two is that the way how mobile livelihood is take place is more and more organized. But organized not in the sense like they organize in a union or develop solidarity among selves, but it's organized by larger companies through financial package. And the third trend, I think, they will be increasingly securitized, because you have to be safe, and they may have to go through regular health check, and they may have to be issued with immunity certificates and after having antibody testing and etc. So the mobility itself will become a subject of security concerns. So that will again, tied back to the role of platform corporations, not only as a financial institutions, but will become institutions of governance. In the future, maybe who control mobility will control the world. I stop here.
Incredibly timed in a way, and then we can smoothly move over to you, John, as in like a response, but also in your own voice, kind of.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I think about these issues a lot. It overlaps a lot with what we study in transport. It reminds me a lot of the theory of the fourth era of travel. So the first era that transport planners talk about a lot is the nomad life, so hypermobile at the beginning of human civilization. The second era is when we stopped moving and we stayed in cities and we started building cities. The third era, which is most of what we know, the beginning of cars and planes and trains. And now we're entering the fourth era, which is when our transport is heavily relying on these platforms that control our mobility. We no longer own, we use these shared platforms, which I think everyone's familiar with. So thank you again, Biao, for allowing me to post on the Compass blog. I can definitely attest to your edits, but I think they made them a greater piece for sure. And I appreciate your point on opinions. So I wanted to kind of just give some quick background. So as Mo mentioned, I study at UCL, so I study transport and city planning. We really focus on why we move around and kind of the systems that allow that to happen. in my previous life and in my current life too, I'm a journalist. So in the past, I've reported on the New York City subway system, which has really, in this current moment, has really been castigated, filling the three roles I'm going to talk about very soon. So I'm going to talk a bit about the blog I wrote for Compass, and then I'll go on to some other thoughts to kind of wrap it all up. And in that blog, I talked about the three roles that transport can have, which I'll talk about in just a second. But first, I just want to start by saying, why is transport important in mobility? Why do we care about transport? So really, transport in my mind has three roles. The first is economic, of course. So how we access resources, opportunities, how we get to our jobs. The lifeline in our economy is our transportation systems. The second is a very social aspect. So it's how we're connected to society. It's how we see our family and friends, and how we see the public in many ways. And also it holds a public health role, right? So it's how we physically get around. And, a lot of our exercise and our kind of daily life from a mental and physical perspective comes from transportation. And then on that note, I think transport has always been crucial in understanding pandemics. I've been thinking about this a lot more, and I think doing research on this and just thinking about pandemics in the past. I mentioned in the blog the ships of the Black Death that kind of brought the plague around Europe. Shipping being the kind of main form of transport in the Middle Age, but also you're looking at the same photos of city streets during the influenza crisis of 1918, 1919, looking very similar to what our streets look like today. I will also say that it's not coincidental that the influenza crisis really occurred at the beginning of industrial transport. So the beginning of planes and cars filling our cities and bringing people around and bringing the virus around in many ways. So on that note, the kind of three roles that I think transport had in COVID-19, I'll start first with what I think is important in understanding the pandemic. I really saw transport as the ultimate super spreader. I think it was a key root cause in how the disease was brought out of Wuhan and out of mainland China and brought all over the world. And a big part of that, in my belief, is that why this is such the worst pandemic we've seen in decades, and also why we're all in lockdown right now. It's because of how hyper connected we all are. I think, a big part of this that we're seeing is that we have so many of these cheap flights, cheap airfare, high speed rail, packed metro systems. We're entering what transport planners call peak car, which is we've never seen this many automobiles before, both in the developed and developing world. Also mass tourism, extended freight lines, all things that kind of produce the global capitalist system that we know today and we're comfortable with, and I think that system that is remarkably under threat because of the pandemic. I think on that note, we've never moved this much. And if you just think of the numbers compared to society in 1918, where there was little cars, little planes, and now we've exponentially grown from that time. And also on that note, there's research that shows that the incubation period, which is this period when you don't feel the symptoms, but you have the virus, really fits perfectly within international flight times. So a lot of people that had the virus were taking international flights going all over the world and therefore spreading it to the rate that we've seen today. The second role I think that transport has is it's been seen as a key vulnerability. So we're seeing this right now. Public transport decimated, the worst operating crisis public transport seen in modern history, and also being blamed for being a transmission mechanism, as I talked about before. We're still unsure of when we'll return to normal public transport numbers. I think that's something we could definitely discuss. And also air travel, seeing a kind of seismic event. I don't think air travel is going to return to normal numbers for quite some time, just based on people's concerns. And additionally, as a vulnerability, transport's been used as an excuse for immobility for vulnerable populations, which I think Biao touched on perfectly. We're seeing border crossings being stopped, refugee resettlements being stopped, transport being kind of used against vulnerable populations in many ways. And the lesson here I think that we can take is that when you make the world this hyper accessible and hyper connected, as many benefits that might have for us, you also make it hyper vulnerable. And, the cost of a crash just kind of grows that much more staggering. And then lastly, and I'll end this, the third role is a bit more uplifting, I promise, is that transport's a weapon. So just as the virus mobilized against us, we can mobilize against the virus. We see this right now with frontline workers using transportation to get to where they need to go, hospitals, nursing homes, grocery stores, the kind of front line of our economy. And also transport is allowing countries to resource share. So countries are sharing PPE, N95 masks, all this kind of resources to fight the pandemic is being used as this international response and coordination mechanism. And then also when a vaccine is finally created, hopefully here in Oxford, transport will be key in distributing it at a massive scale, a scale that we've never seen before in modern society. So transport will really be vital in that kind of response. But just to kind of end this on a note looking forward, because it's something that we're certainly thinking about in transportation and, we're seeing in cities happening around the world, is that we're looking at a face mask future, right? We're looking at a future that social distancing will be the norm for sure. And I think that we need to kind of think about transport as a weapon from its public health role. So across the world right now, and it's something that I briefly mentioned in the story in early April in Compass, or it might have been late March, and it's grown exponentially since then, the amount of cities that are doing this. We're seeing cities open up streets for people to properly social distance, and we're seeing a massive spike in walking and cycling. I just recently saw that London is predicting a 10-fold increase in biking and a 5-fold increase in walking in the next coming months. And we know that transport's directly related to recovery. Air pollution, all this research coming out that's saying air pollution caused by our movement and our demand. So our cars, our lorries on the roads, is being looked at as a potential booster of the virus. Air quality directly linked to how your lungs can handle the virus and how vulnerable populations can handle the virus. And also favored modes like walking and cycling can add to physical and mental health benefits at a time when we know those are going to be more in demand. And also just to kind of end on these questions, I think we need to consider what our future mobilities look like. Will we favor the privacy of cars because we're scared of going on public transport? We're scared of people, which we're seeing right now in Wuhan. The initial modal shift numbers are pretty worrisome for public transport. We're seeing cars spike, double, and we're seeing the use of buses and metro fall pretty precipitously. And then also, will we shift our movements to be more local rather than global, which of course has implications for air travel and emissions, and also the mobility of vulnerable populations and migrant populations. And also, will our global accessibility all of a sudden just rev back right back to where it was, to what we were used to before this all happened? And it basically, in sum, just to kind of leave you one last thought, really, what does transport look like after a global lockdown? Everything we just talked about with transportation, what does that look like after we come out of a lockdown? And I think those are the thoughts I'm kind of entering May in as we kind of reopen to some extent.
Ooh, really nice.